We have a flavorful level up today as Aether Drift swiftly approaches. Welcome to Limited Level Ups, everybody. This week we're talking the ins and outs, tips, and tricks for racing in a game of Limited. Partially, of course, because it's sort of on brand with the new set, but mostly, I just love opportunities to do gameplay level up episodes. As I always say, I think that gameplay tends to be a little bit underexplored in the world of Limited content. I think these days the average Limited player is just a much better drafter than they are a game player, so let's see if we can fix a little bit of that today, give you a bit of a tune-up, and let's just jump in. So, to understand racing, I think you really have to understand the classic Magic concept called Who's the Beatdown. And Who's the Beatdown? Article written by Mike Flores, who's a longtime Magic player, longtime Magic theorist. It was written way back in 1999, and if you haven't read this article before, I think a lot of people watching and listening to this episode are going to find it kind of rudimentary, to be honest. But it was really revolutionary at the time to a lot of people, and I think still very relevant today. I'm going to link the article in the description if you want to read it, but if you haven't read it and just want the gist of it, Mike mainly talks about how in each game of Magic, one player is supposed to assume the beatdown role, and the other player is supposed to assume the control role in the matchup, which is basically just saying one player is supposed to end the game, because otherwise if they don't end the game, they're not going to win the late game, and the other player is supposed to say, okay, well, I'm actually the one that's advantaged in the late game as this match goes on. I'm supposed to defend, I'm supposed to play the control role in this matchup. There's a few factors to figuring out what role you are supposed to play, and we'll get into those in a minute, but the main thing that Mike says at the end is that if you misassign your role in that game, that equals a game loss. It's basically as good as saying you were playing the game wrong from the start and you're going to lose because of it. If you're trying to play the control role and your opponent has a better late game than you, and there were signs of their gameplay and the cards they were playing that could imply to you, and you could figure out, you kind of deduce that, hey, maybe I'm not the better deck as the game goes on. If you didn't know that, if you didn't take that in, then you're going to lose that game most likely. So if you are trying to figure out the role that your deck is supposed to take, it should generally start as you're drafting and in your deck build, right? The things before you jump into your games. And I might even give myself like a rough 1 to 10 rating of my deck, just like how aggro versus controlling I am, if you're having a little bit of trouble with that, with, 1 being super aggressive, 10 being super controlling. I think it's just good to get a sense of that before you jump into the games. But I think something that a lot of people miss about this is that the deck build is just the start of this role assessment, right? It's the baseline, it's the starting point. Sometimes I'll be doing deck techs in my Discord, or maybe I'm in a coaching session, and the deck that we're looking at, maybe it's like generally aggressive leaning, and the person I'm talking to will maybe ask me something like, all right, how should I be playing this deck? Like, is it super aggressive? Should I be attacking every single turn? And that's a tough question to answer, because, I can say, yeah, generally this deck wants to attack, but the specifics of the game that you're playing, they matter a ton. Like, once you jump into the game, things completely change. Your assessment of how aggressive you should be, that's only relative to your opponent's deck and what's actually happening in the game. So, like I said, that 1 to 10 aggro versus control rating of your deck, you don't just make that assessment in deck building, never let go of it, and play your games accordingly. You should use that as a baseline, but then you should tweak that baseline once you, A, know what kind of deck you're facing, maybe, color combination, roughly how aggressive or controlling you think they're going to be, and B, you're going to change that assessment once you see how the game plays out. What's your opening hand look like? Is it a reactive opening hand with a bunch of your removal spells? Is it a hand where you've got a clear 1, 2, 3, 4 nice curve out? Your answer to those kind of questions, which are questions you should be asking yourself, just saying like, okay, how do I see this hand playing out? Is it going to be a nice beatdown hand, or is it going to be a little bit slower? Your answer to those kind of questions should influence how you see your role in the game you're playing. And even though you saw yourself as an aggro beatdown deck as you were drafting and deck building, you still need to tweak that and reevaluate that every step of the way as you're playing your games. I've got a deck in front of me here. It's a red-white Duskmourn deck, and I would largely say it's an aggressive deck. Like, it's not the most aggressive streamlined deck in the world with a bunch of 1s and 8 2-drops. But when I click Let's Play after I've done my deck build, I would assume that I'm going to be the beatdown in a lot of matchups in the format. However, I also have 2 really, really good 5-drops. I've got a Dissection Tools and I've got a Ghostly Dancers. And if I have an opening hand with those 2 cards, let's just say it's those 2 good 5-drops, 4 lands, and a 2/2. Just like a 2/2 with a minor ability, Hand That Feeds, or Ragged Playmate, for example. So I have that opening hand, and I say, okay, I got 2 pretty good 5-drops, so, I want to be able to get to the point where I can use these, take advantage of them. And so then I go, okay, well, what's my opponent doing? If they're doing anything within the realm of trying to attack me, as in, as long as they're not like a blue-black control deck, I'm going to tweak what I thought my role originally was and probably instead of wanting to attack with that 2-drop, I'm going to want to trade it off so I can get to my 5-drops. The opposite of this happens quite often too, where it's not two aggressive decks going at each other and one goes, oh, actually, I should take the defensive role. When you have two control decks going at it, often one of them is going to say, oh, I submitted my deck and I was a controlling deck, but my opponent actually is a bit better at playing the late game than me, or has some sort of card that advantages them way more than I would be advantaged, even though I have card draw and grindy tools in my deck as this game goes on. A recent example is from Pioneer Masters. This one actually came up for me personally. So I was playing a blue-black control deck, bunch of card draw, a bunch of removal, just, standard blue-black control, and my opponent played a Sphinx's Tutelage on turn 3, which is a 3-mana blue enchantment that says whenever you draw a card, target opponent mills 2 cards, and if those 2 cards share a color, you mill another 2 cards to repeat that process, and basically this card just sits there and mills you out pretty quickly. When Tutelage comes down, it completely throws a wrench in my plan of just sit back, draw a bunch of cards, remove all their threats, because I need to take the beatdown roll, right? I can't let this thing just sit there and mill me out. I'm going to lose the game in 5-6 turns. So that's my red flag to say, you know what? I might have gone into this match thinking I was a control deck, but that's not the role I need to play here. I need to cobble together something, even though my deck isn't that good at beating down. Maybe I find a flyer or a few threats and I use my removal spells to get blockers out of the way. And, I just eke out enough damage to kill them. It's not a great position to be in as the control deck, right? Because most of your cards are geared towards extending the game. They're geared towards reacting to your opponent. But if the beatdown role is the one that you realize you need to take because the alternative is you just die to the tutelage in a few turns, then yeah, you're going to pick the better of 2 bad options. So if this is something that you feel like you need a little bit of work on, or as you've heard me talk about this, you're like, hey, yeah, maybe I don't have the greatest idea of, what role I'm supposed to take game in, game out. Well, I think a few things to consider. Number one, when you have a very polarized matchup, like you're a aggro deck versus a hard blue counterspell control deck, it's clear, right? It's pretty easy to figure out you're supposed to be the beatdown. But one thing to take in is that the closer your deck is in strategy to your opponent's deck, the tougher it becomes to figure out your role. Even though you might both be aggro decks, you still need to assess which player is more benefited in the short or long term by both players' life totals being lowered. And this is a skill, right? It's a skill to be able to look at a game state and say who's advantaged in that game. I think it's something that's best learned by watching other people. I would recommend, Paul Cheon's really good at just talking out his thoughts of who should be the beatdown, who should be the control. I think Kenji's generally pretty good at this, although Kenji does tend to play the slower decks more often than not. I try to do my best when I stream to talk out these kind of thoughts. So it's just something that you're going to pick up on as you watch good players play. But I also think there are some questions you can ask yourself when you're in one of those aggro versus aggro matchups or control versus control matchups. The way I tend to think about it is if you're in a sort of mirror-ish match, you should try to take the role that your deck wants to take, right? Like, don't automatically assume, I'm aggro versus aggro, but I'm on the draw, so I should be defense. No, it's not exactly that, because sometimes your opponent stumbles, sometimes you have an exceptionally fast hand. I think you should try to play to the strength of your deck. So the key is figuring out when you shouldn't do that, right? What are the triggers to go like, oh, I should actually swap roles here? So for those aggro versus aggro matchups, a few things. One, the opponent gets on board quicker than you. You have your opening hand, you're like, great, 2, 3, 4, we're all set to go. We got a removal spell, a combat trick, but your opponent's on the play and they go 1, 2, 3, right? So they've curved out quicker than you. Maybe their 1-drops attack into your 2-drops, and you're like, okay, well, yeah, I actually probably should play the defensive role for a little bit, at least for the early turns, just so I don't get run over. Related to this, if the opponent somehow has a head start in the race, if they get on board quickly, they're often going to have a head start in the race, but if they play like a cheap lifelinker or something, that throws a wrench in your aggressive plan. You probably have to deal with that before you mount an offense of your own. Another thing to clock is just what your hand allows you to do and what the cards you draw over the course of the game allow you to do. Maybe you start with a hand of 2 removal spells, 2 creatures, and some lands. You play a 2, your opponent plays a 2, your opponent plays a 3, you play a 3, and you have these 2 removal spells in hand, and over the course of the last few turns, you've just drawn removal spells. Well, you probably can't pressure that well, because you've got a bunch of removal spells in hand. So you kind of have to go, okay, well, I'm not going to try to race them. I'm going to try to deal with their threats early, and then hope to draw into more threats after, right? You kind of have to make those assessments if your draw doesn't go perfectly. Here's one that comes up pretty often. You start to run out of steam. I often find that when people start to run out of steam when they're playing an aggro versus aggro matchup. They go, all right, well, I'm drawing all lands, so I got to end this game quickly. That often backfires if you try to be like, well, I got to end the game now because I'm drawing lands. Because what happens is you just don't end up with enough resources to end the game. Your opponent puts up blockers and you can't get through them. Your opponent casts removal spells on your few threats you have. I often find it's better to just lay back for a few turns. Don't scramble to the end of the game if your opponent's still at 12, but you don't have the resources to do so. Like, if your opponent is at a high enough life total and you just don't have any good cards in hand or just have all lands, you just need to chill. It's not a great position to be in, but generally you want to kind of give yourself some time to draw into some of your better cards so you do have the chance to get your opponent from 12 to 0 rather than going all out, putting them to 4, and then just not being able to win at all. In control versus control matchups, the thing that often matters is card draw or engine cards. Just something that will advantage you as the game goes on. And if you're the person who doesn't have those, or your opponent sticks an early one and goes like, okay, I'm going to draw a bunch of cards with this entity tracker, from Duskmourn, for example, 2/3 flash, whenever you trigger Ear, you draw a card. If they land that and you don't have a removal spell in hand, well, I'm probably thinking, well, I'm not going to sit around here until I just draw my removal and kill this thing. They'll have drawn 5 cards off of it before that happens. I instead go, well, I should probably just end this game somehow. I should use my removal to get through some blockers, even though they're not impressive, get that 2-mana 3/3 defender out of the way just so my creatures can attack. Or, it doesn't even have to be something as pressing as an entity tracker. The opponent could have just cast 2 Glimmer Bursts, be up 3 cards at that point, and you're like, well, I haven't cast any of my card draw spells, and the cards in my hand aren't super impressive. Like, I don't have like an awesome 7-drop that if I just survive and slam that, I'll win. I should probably break out of my control role and try to kill them. When you find yourself in a mid-range versus mid-range match, this is the tricky one because there's no real default, right? So you kind of have to start from the ground up, just take into account all the resources that both players have, right? Like, how many cards in hand? What are the life totals? What do the boards look like? Think about your deck. Do you have reasons to play to the late game? Does your hand have good top end? The mid-range versus mid-range matchup is the one where you're going to be doing the most reassessment, turn in, turn out. Right? Like, for those other decks, it's like, okay, you're just going along until something changes and you're like, nope, I'm supposed to be the beatdown, or no, I'm not supposed to. For the mid-range decks, which is, the majority of limited decks, really, it's a lot more like a dance, right? Your opponent brings something to the table, you counteract that, you make a play that lines up well against it, they do something in response, the game changes, and you have to just reassess every single turn. This is the kind of stuff that I think you really pick up from watching other players play. It's the kind of like turn in, turn out reassessment that I can't give you here, basically. There's not as many good outlines as I can give you for these kind of matchups. But yeah, the most important thing I can say for these matchups to keep in mind is just keep reevaluating every single game action if you can. The last layer here for all this who's the beatdown stuff, once you do feel like you've developed a good sense game in, game out of the role you're supposed to take and when that changes, when certain things happen in game, the next level is assessing your opponent's assessment of their role, right? Like, your opponent is going to give you clues that tell you what they think their role is. So if you attack into their 2-mana 2/2 with your 2/2 and they don't block, well, that probably means that they think you're either racing or they're supposed to be the beatdown, right? Or take that red-white deck with the 2 awesome 5-drops as an example that I just talked about, right? Like, know that when my opponent, my red-white opponent, blocks with their 2-drop, that tips me off to thinking, oh, they don't think they're the beatdown. I need to factor that into what I think I should be doing. And generally that means if they don't think they're the beatdown and they have good reasons to play the late game, then you should try to end the game. Again, this is the layer on top of figuring out your role correctly. If you get your role wrong, it doesn't matter what you think your opponent's role is. But even if you're not a master at this, you can definitely pick up on these clues as the game goes on based on what the opponent's doing. What kind of cards they're casting at certain times, where they choose to attack or block, those kind of things. And that's going to bring us to this episode's main topic, which is talking about racing. So for the rest of the episode, we are going to be very dialed in, specifically talking about what to do in a race and, just best practices and identifying if you're in a race. But I started this episode deep diving on who's the beatdown because I think understanding the concept of who's the beatdown, and not just the concept, but having a somewhat good sense of your in-game assessment of your role is sort of a prerequisite to understanding and being good at racing. Reason being is that when you boil it down, a racing situation is effectively just both players saying, yes, I am the beatdown, I believe I'm the beatdown, I believe I can end the game before you can, and I recognize that you also seem to think that, but I believe given the hidden information of what's in my hand, or maybe what's in my deck, I'm going to be more advantaged taking that beatdown role than you will. And with that in mind, you might be thinking, well, hold on now, what happened to the whole Mike Flores mantra of misassignment of game role equals game loss, right? Like, if both players think they're the beatdown, one player has to be wrong, right? It's complex. Yes and no. This is where hidden information really makes a difference. What is in each player's hand that the other player can't see? So if both players play the game face up, like they just showed each other their hands and their decks, so they had true perfect information of what was coming, and it turned into more of a collaborative game rather than a competitive game, right? The goal is to figure out who's going to win this race, given all our cards faced up. I'm sure two competent players would come to the agreement that player A or player B would win. Like, they go like, oh, you've got this lifelink trick and you've got this, lava axe, deal 5 to the face. You're actually probably more advantaged in the race, even though I had some removal, some combat tricks. Looked like I was pretty set up to race, but actually, no, you're the one with the advantage here. But of course, most games of Magic do contain hidden information. Most games, you don't know what's in your opponent's hand, and you still have to make the best choice you can with the information you have. So when you have a hand that you think does put you in that beatdown role, puts you in a good position to win that race, and your opponent thinks the same thing, you're essentially making a bet that you're right and your opponent is wrong. And given the known information that both players have at the time, it can be correct for both of them to think that they should take the beatdown role, even though when it plays out, one's gonna win. To relate this to something like poker, it could be the case that you look at your hand, you're like 4 of a kind, that's a great hand, all in. And your opponent's like, oh, I actually have a straight flush, all in. If you had the 4 of a kind, yeah, I would bet on myself too, right? That's a really good hand. That beats a lot of hands, but it just doesn't happen to beat the straight flush. I could walk up to a game being played at my local game store and look at one player's hand and look at the board state and think, yeah, I think I would race in this situation. They've got, a Healer's Hawk, and they've got a Felidar Savior, some lifelink creatures. They've got a combat trick that gives flying, so they can, get those final few points. I might say, yep, you're supposed to take the beatdown roll. You're going to be advantaged in this race. That totally makes sense. All that lifelink really gives you a nice buffer, makes it almost impossible for the opponent to race. But then, if I magically erase my memory of what I saw of that player's hand, go to the other side of the table, take in the known information, look at the board state, look at the attacker's blockers, and I see they have a Hidetsugu Second Right in hand, which is the 4-mana red instant that deals 10 to somebody if they're exactly at 10. Well, even in the face of lifelinkers, if I go, oh, they're pretty close to 10, and I think you can get them to 10 pretty quickly, I would say, actually, you're the one who's supposed to take the beatdown roll. Normally against lifelinkers, you can't race them. You have to just block them or try to kill them, but it's still worth pressuring the opponent if you've got Hidetsugu Second Right in hand, because your goal isn't to get them to 0, you just have to get them to 10. So when you think racing is on the table, when it's an option to consider, or when the opponent seems to want to race, like you're on the play and you attack your 2/2 into their 2/2, and they don't block, and you go, okay, that's sort of interesting. You've kind of collected some information there. You say, seems that they don't want to take the control role. They seem to want to race. The next step is figuring out if you should race or if you should take the control role, because when the opponent doesn't block there, they're essentially telling you that their hand is good at racing, right? And you need to look at your hand and go, well, is my hand good at racing? And to be clear, sometimes that moment of confirmation where you might be racing or, your opponent seems to want to race might not happen till turn 5 or 6 or something. I'm just using the 2/2 attacking into a 2/2 in the early game, just as kind of a clear example. But anyways, the big question you're asking yourself here is, am I set up to race? And let's talk about how to answer that question. Sort of a basic one, but tying this back down to who's the beatdown, do you have the right tools? Do you have a bunch of threats and combat tricks and ways to push damage, or do you have card draw and removal spells? Obviously, the first one is much better at racing than the second one. You're not going to want to try to get your one threat in with a bunch of removal spells, although sometimes that works, right? Sometimes you do just, the one threat goes all the way if it's an exceptionally good threat and the opponent doesn't have an answer, but most of the time, when you're looking at your hand and you're saying, can I race here? You do want multiple threats. Next up, you've got to consider life totals. You've got to consider your clock, your opponent's clock. Take in both your life total and your opponent's life total. If the board is developed a little bit, kind of map out, okay, if we just attacked each other every single turn, no blocks on either side, who wins first, right? That's your clock. Just the raw numbers of how many turns will it take for me to kill my opponent and how many turns will it take for them to kill me. The purpose of this isn't to map out the next 3 turns exactly to, the exact points of damage you're going to deal. You just want to figure out, do I have a chance in this race? Am I in the right ballpark? Like, if you're at 14 and your opponent's at 21, and you both roughly have the same damage output, well, unless your hand has exceptionally good racing tools, you probably shouldn't take part in that race. Sometimes you get into a race not because you think you're necessarily advantaged in the race, but you're forced to because of the kind of threats your opponent has. So if your opponent has a really, really big attacker early, I'm going to use Renegade Freighter as an example. This is a vehicle from Original Kaladesh. It's a 3-mana 4/3 that when it attacks, it gets +1/+1, gains trample, and crew 2. So it's effectively a 3-mana 5/4 trampler. That's not something that's easy to single block, And it's something that you don't really want to double block, because double blocks in the early game when you're generally going to be tapped out don't go well for you, because any trick or interaction is a huge blowout, right? So you kind of just say in the face of that, well, I can't really block that. Either you literally can't block it because you just don't have the power and toughness, or you just really think it's a bad idea to try to block. I'm going to race instead. If your opponent has flyers, obviously that's another situation where it's like, well, I can't really block those, and unless my hand has a bunch of removal spells, like I can't really deal with these, so I guess I have to race. Or sometimes, you have creatures that just can't block on both sides. Like I had this in the Pioneer Masters Arena Open where I had a bunch of Rimrock Knights, which are 3/1s that can't block. My opponent had the same thing. We were just, going back and forth, and my hand actually didn't have that much action in it, to be honest, but, I just had to race because what else was I going to do? I literally can't block. So if you think it is possible that you want to race, if you think that your hand might be set up to race, you go, okay, life totals, we're about even, and our clocks are about even, and I've got some threats in hand. My hand isn't slow. My hand doesn't have a bunch of card draw spell or all reactive stuff. The next step I take is putting a stamp on just how good my hand is at racing, right? You've identified, okay, I'm decent at racing, but your hand on the cards you have, or the cards on the board, right? That matters too, but hand, I think, is the one that matters most because that's the hidden information that your opponent doesn't have access to. You want to evaluate roughly how good is your hand at racing. Is it, to use the poker analogy, is it at 4 of kind or straight flush, or is it, maybe a 2 pair? It's okay at racing, but the reason you want to make this assessment is you want to figure out how good your bet is, essentially, right? Because if your opponent is attacking you just relentlessly and you're like, wow, they really believe that they can win the race, you want to ask, how many cards in my hand help in a race against an opponent who clearly thinks that they're the one that's going to win the race? So we're going to go through just a bunch of card types that are good in races so that when you look at your hand and you've got, 2 out of the 3 spells or 3 out of the 4 spells in your hand fall into the camp of cards that are good at racing, you can more confidently say, yep, I'm happy to place this bet that I will actually be the one that comes out on top. So first up, kind of a gimme, evasion. Anything that flies, menace counts too. Basically anything that just makes it harder for your opponent to block, especially when you have flyers and you can just say, all right, well, I'm counting the clock of my flyers. Let's say you have 2, 3 power flyers in play. And unless you've got removal or flyers of your own, I can just chump on the ground all day and I'm going to win this race, right? They just put you in a good place to use your removal spells to win a race. You can just worry about not dying basically as this unblockable 3-power clock gets through. So anytime you've got flyers, I'm like, yeah, I'm happy to take part in this race. My example here, actually, Liev Sky Knight from Pioneer Masters, which is the 1 blue-white 3/1 flyer, an exceptional racer, because when it comes in, it detains a non-land permanent, which is basically can't attack or block for the next turn. Exactly the kind of card you want in a race. Burn spells tend to be pretty good in races, either to kill a creature for cheap or just have it in your hand as hidden information that your opponent's mapping out how many turns it takes for them to kill you. They don't know you have this lightning strike in hand, and they think, okay, I can kill my opponent in 3 turns, but really, you get to kill them the turn before that because they weren't accounting for them being at 3 lower life. Any 1-mana removal spell, or actually just 1-mana spells in general, just cheap spells tend to be pretty good in races. But when you got something like a shock, right, just single red mana, deals 2 to any target. Not only can that be used to go to the face, but you can have some really, really nice tempo turns where it actually sometimes turns into not a race at all after this happens, where you go like, I'm going to play a 2-drop, another 2-drop, and then shock your 3-drop. Sometimes that completely flips the race on its head on its own, and your opponent actually has to take the defensive role because you've dampened their forces, you put some threats on board, you did it all in 1 turn, and now it's like, oh yeah, this race has just completely changed at this point. Combat tricks tend to be pretty good in races, just they act as that unknown information that, maybe you go to the face with a pump spell on an unblocked creature, or with some pump spells that are really, really good, Archon's Glory from Wilds of Eldraine is an example here. Single white mana, instant, target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn, but if you bargained it, the creature gets flying and lifelink. Flying and lifelink are 2 of the best keywords in a race, right? Because lifelink's honestly just broken in races. Like anything you can do to gain life or have a lifelink creature, that honestly usually means that your opponent can't race. So if you ever have a lifelink creature, that's awesome. But even just 1 burst of lifelink, gaining 5, 6 life, that can completely swing a race. The flying mode of a combat trick kind of acts as that final few points that your opponent didn't expect coming, kind of like the lightning strike. As an offshoot of that, we have creatures that drain, so something like Grasping Thrall or vampire spawn, these things that come in. The opponent loses 2 life, you gain 2 life. These are some of the best cards in races. Cards that make tokens or cards that come with multiple bodies tend to be excellent in races because, well, one half of the card is attacking, you can assign the other half of the card to blocking. Especially good if some of that card is evasive, right? Like Preening Champion from March of the Machine, 3 mana 2/2 flyer, comes with a 1/1 token. That was one of the best cards you could have in a race in that format because it gave you an evasive threat and it gave you a trump blocker. Gear per Gearcrafter from Pioneer Masters, that's 3 mana 2/1, comes with a 1/1 flying token, similar. Writhing Chrysalis, of course, is kind of the epitome of this and why that card was so obnoxious to play against, because if you were in a race at any point of the game and a Writhing Chrysalis came down, you're just like, it's no longer a race. I can no longer attack in the air, I can no longer attack on the ground, and my opponent has a gigantic blocker that's then going to hit me back for 1,000,000 damage on the way back. Yeah, not that we need to reverse engineer why Writhing Chrysalis was good any longer than we already have, but it's just a really good example. And the amount of haste tends to be pretty good because that's just one more thing that your opponent doesn't know about, they're not expecting coming when they're calculating their own clock. Razorkin Hordecaller, an exceptionally good haste creature at racing. This is the 5 mana 4/4 haste from Duskmourn that whenever you attack, you make a 1/1. So not only is it surprise 4 damage that your opponent might not be anticipating, but it also gives you a blocker, so be able to block on the way back. Active Treason effects that steal your opponent's creature for the turn, and you get to attack with them. Sometimes you're playing a red, black, steel, and sack deck, and you're playing those because you want to combo them with sacrifice cards, take your opponent's cards and sacrifice them. But at times you look at your hand and you're like, I'm pretty good at racing. I've got maybe a token maker or two. I've got this Ariad's Tempting Apple, for an example. This is the one from Wilds of Eldraine. Actually, I think one of the best active treasons we've ever seen. This is the 4 mana, comes in, takes something to the end of turn, and then it also has 2 abilities. 2 tap sack it, you gain 3 life, or 2 tap sack it, target opponent loses 3 life. So whatever you need to do there, right? Whatever you need to do to swing the race, the apple's kind of got your back. Overrun effects or mass pump spell effects, these are really good in races. They tend to be, honestly, like the impetus to racing sometimes. You're like, I just want to get my opponent down to 12, and then I cast all my creatures get +2/+1, or all my creatures get +3/+3 trample. If I can just deal the early 7 points or something, then I'm good in this game, right? That's my goal. And then blue effects. A lot of blue effects tend to be pretty good in races. We've got like the Frost Trickster variant, the 2 mana 2/2 that comes in, taps something down, doesn't tap during your opponent's next untap step. Any Mana War variant, so the things that bounce creatures to your owner's hand. Unnerving Grasp is a great example. 3 mana sorcery, Manifest Dread, return a non-land permanent to its owner's hand. These are exceptional in races. Your opponent needing to spend time to redeploy their threats, that's going to be set back so far, while helping you get in more damage too. And then of course, the best things in races are cards that do multiple of these things. So they gain life and they make multiple bodies, or maybe deal a bit of damage and have flying. I picked out a few examples from Aether Drift that are very good at racing. So Haunt the Network, first one here. I actually think this is going to be one of the best uncommons. So this is 3 black, blue for a sorcery. Choose target opponent. Create 2 1/1 colorless Thopter tokens with flying, and then the chosen player loses X life and you gain X life, where X is the number of artifacts you control. So kind of just does everything you want in a race, right? It's life gain, it's life loss, it's multiple bodies, it's flying. Yeah, I expect this card to be really good. And then another one that I think is going to be pretty good too, Roadside Assistance. This is 2 and a white for an enchantment aura at uncommon. Enchant a creature or a vehicle. When the aura enters, you make a pilot token, and then the enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has lifelink. So not only is it making a token, but it's giving something lifelink, it's giving something a buff. And often, honestly, when you're going through a new set, just evaluating cards, a pretty good rule of thumb is if the card is good in a race, especially on 2 axes, like Haunted Network, it gains life, it makes tokens, or with Roadside Assistant, kind of does the same thing, makes a token, makes a body, and gains life. If it does 2 things in a race, it's generally going to be a pretty good card. Obviously, mana cost is something you have to consider. Cards' text boxes do not exist in a vacuum, but often when I'm saying like, oh yeah, that's a really good card, it ticks 2 of those boxes of those good in a race multiple ways. So let's get into talking about some gameplay tips regarding racing. And this is where the limits of the podcast format get a little bit stretched, because this is a very contextual thing. I'm going to do my best to give you some broad, just heuristics, some rules of thumb, best practices, all that. But you do have to do some work in game, right? You have to use that brain. You do have to say, okay, what's actually going on here? Make some evaluations, and just be smart about things. But in general, kind of the game you're playing when you're racing, considering everything we just talked about so far, is both players have come and they've said, all right, I think I'm pretty good at racing. You might be good at racing too, but I've got some hidden information that tells me I'm actually going to be better in this race, right? That's the concept we've been talking about this whole time. Of course, I'm assuming that both players have mathed things out right, and their clock is actually faster than your clock. Just like, you don't have an opponent that's just racing you for no reason. But if you do assume that you're going, okay, I'm going to attack you, you're going to attack me, maybe we block some places, maybe I don't. If both players feel like they're going to win the race, then what the game comes down to is figuring out what hidden information do they have, what tools do they have in their hand that actually make them think they're advantaged in this race. And the way this plays out is you might be racing back and forth, and then you cast your lifelink combat trick. Not necessarily just to gain life, like, maybe you're using it after the opponent blocks, but if you cast your lifelink trick, something that's very, very good in a race, you win the combat, you gain 5 life, and the opponent still keeps attacking you, they're like, nope, I'm just the beatdown purely. I'm not really even trying to block. You have to think, okay, they've got something up their sleeves. Maybe it's a mass pump spell. Maybe it's a burn spell that deals 5 damage to my face or something like that. But after you've gained that 5 life and you reevaluate the clocks and you just say, okay, there's no way that my opponent wins this race without another good spell in their hand that can help them win the race. You think, all right, they must have something else. And then you look at your hand and you go, do I have more tools in my hand that can help me win this race? Was I just banking on that, that lifelink trick to be the thing that swings the race? If I was, and I assume my opponent has more things that make this race make sense to them, then I probably have to give into the race, right? I probably have to resign my role as the beatdown or vying for that beatdown role. I have to say, all right, I'm going to trust my opponents making rational plays. I'm going to trust that they do have a reason to keep attacking me. I probably have to play defense for a little bit if you don't have any more good tools for racing. But the opposite thing can happen where it's like, all right, they still think they're racing, but they don't know that I have this drain spell in hand, or I've got this flyer that drains them for 2 when it comes in, right? They weren't accounting for that. So after I play that, I then reevaluate again, right? And both players are going to be reevaluating. I'm going to say, well, what's my clock now? And the opponent's going to say, well, what's my clock now? And every time that happens, every time you cast a spell, it doesn't even necessarily have to be a spell that swings the race, but anything that affects the board, or anything that affects the race, even in a small amount. Both players should be reevaluating if they are still in contention to win this race. And if you don't reevaluate and you're not taking in that your opponent is still attacking, even though you think you're favored, then you're probably going to lose that game. And vice versa. If the opponent doesn't do that, then you're probably going to win that game. The key here is just keep reevaluating, right? It's something I mentioned earlier in the episode, but you really just need to keep reevaluating every single step of the way. You can also read kind of their smaller plays too. So I'll give you an example. If the opponent attacks with a really good blocker, right? Let's just say you've got 3 3/3s and they've got just like 1 5/5. And you could double block that 5/5, right? They attack with the 5/5 and you could double block 2 3/3s. Maybe you don't want to risk the double block, but if you're considering it, I would assume that if they're attacking with that 5/5 and the race is kind of close, they've got a really good blocker coming down, right? They've got something that maybe stabilizes them by gaining life, maybe makes multiple bodies. They're not just going to attack that 5/5 into your 3/3s, 1, without a trick or a removal spell, because that attack just doesn't make sense. And 2, they're not going to tap their creature just to get attacked by a bunch of 3/3s back, right? They're going to have something that stabilizes. So even just an attack like that sets off alarm bells to me. And I'll often say when I'm streaming, like, oh, that's an interesting attack. Like, that probably means they have a good follow-up after this. So you can kind of deduce what the opponent might have in their hand, but you also can deduce what they might do main phase 2 after they go to combat, because the level 1 thinking there is like, oh, they attack with their 5/5, great, I can attack them back for 9. No, of course, that's not exactly how it's going to play out. And this is important because maybe the situation is a little bit different, and actually you have those blockers and they're attacking you with the 5/5, but you also have a removal spell you could cast on the 5/5, and you go, okay, well, they're attacking me for 5, and like, that's a lot. I don't necessarily want to take it. I could use my removal spell. But you're still reasonably healthy. Maybe you're at like, 13 or something. Taking 5 puts you down to 8. And you go, okay, well, they're going to play another blocker. Maybe you want to use a removal spell on that blocker because it's a better creature. Number 1, they might be stabilizing with a bigger creature. Or you go, well, they're turning to 5/5 sideways. And if I kill the next creature that comes down, then I can attack for 9, and that actually swings the race in my favor. So you're going to want to pick up on these context clues as much as you can. And it's tricky, right? This is the skill that you're training. Everything we talked about today, like, that is, that's what it's amounting to. You're taking in all the little pieces of context that your opponent gives you, taking in what your hand is, and then you're trying to figure out the best course of action. One thing you can do in a race that you might be losing is you might want to bluff a little bit more, right? Because if you're in a spot where you're like, I'm just not going to win this race if I don't sneak in a few points of damage each time or on this turn. It might even just be one turn where you're just like, okay, if I just sneak in 3 points of damage right now when the opponent's tapped out and they're not that likely to block, that actually could win the race. Like, I can definitely remember at least a handful of games in my lifetime that I've played where I'm like, if I didn't sneak in this 2 points of damage here, when I thought, the race wasn't in my favor and I needed to bluff them, then I would have lost this game. So bluffing, that's a whole other topic that we could talk about another time. But in general, you only want to bluff your opponent, which is like, attacking your 2-2 into their 3-3. You only want to bluff the opponent generally when you have a lot to gain and not a lot to lose. But if you think that the race is completely not in your favor, and maybe you think you have to race, right? You're just one of those situations where the opponent's got all flyers and you just can't block. It's like, okay, well, I just have to race for the most part. If that's the case, yeah, you might just want to bluff just to get in those few extra points. Another question that really helps to ask yourself this as much as you can is, can I afford to play around a removal spell? Because you often end up in these situations where the race is really tight and you go, okay, I'm going to leave back one blocker that can block their one big thing. I make a pretty big attack this turn, and then the turn after, I can kill them. But as I'm sure many of you have experienced in your Magic playing career, if you leave back one blocker and then they draw a removal spell, well, you might just lose the game on the spot right there. So sometimes it's unavoidable. Sometimes you're just like, well, I attacked with the things I need to attack with, so that next turn I could set up lethal. I left back a blocker. They just happen to have it. But take the next step and ask, what if I leave back 2 blockers? Does that change the clock? Like, you still want to be able to kill them on the next turn, most likely. That's the main goal. And so if you don't need that additional attacker, if you attack with everything -2 creatures that you plan to block with, you'll still have lethal next turn. Then you should do that, right? It can be very easy to get overzealous in the race and just be like, I want to deal as much damage as possible. But you really should map out how many turns it's going to take to kill them. This is where the math comes in. This is where the hard thinking comes in. This is where you can't just act on vibes. You actually have to map out combat, how it's going to play out over the next 2 turns. And again, sometimes you go, nope, I actually do need to attack with everything but one creature. Otherwise, I can't kill them next turn. But in a lot of spots, that's not true. And you actually should map it out, figure out if you can leave back that additional blocker to play your own removal spell. Anyways, that is going to do it for today. Thank you so much for watching and listening. If you like the show and you want to support it, do go check out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. As I always say, we are a crowdfunded show over here. Really does help the show keep on going. Go check that out if you want to support the show or are interested in some rewards over there that we want to offer. Next week, I think next Tuesday, we've got the sort of set review with Mark and I. So we're not doing a full card by card set review this time. I'm not going to tell you exactly the details of it, but I can promise it's still going to be a pretty hefty piece of content. We're approaching things slightly different this time because, number one, we want to try some new things out. But number two, we do actually think that this is going to be a better way to onboard people to the new set. So do look forward to that. That's coming out next week. Do subscribe if you haven't already. And thanks for watching and listening, everybody. We'll see you next time.